There are some phone calls that divide your life into two parts. There is the life you remember before the call, and there is everything that comes after it. 15 years ago, I received a phone call that told me my son had been sentenced to prison for a crime I couldn't bring myself to believe he had committed. Yesterday, I thought I had finally learned how to live with that pain. Then my phone rang again, and the voice on the other end forced me to question every memory I had carried for 15 years. Before I tell you what happened, I want you to think about something. If someone you loved was convicted of a terrible crime, and every piece of evidence seemed to prove they were guilty, would you still believe them if they told you years later that they had been framed? My name is Evelyn Carter, and my son Nathan was 24 years old when his life was destroyed. He had been a quiet young man who worked as an electrical technician and spent most of his free time repairing old cars. Nathan wasn't perfect. He could be stubborn, impatient, and occasionally reckless with his decisions, but he had never been violent. He was the kind of person who would stop on the side of the road to help someone with a flat tire. He had a younger sister named Melissa, and although they argued like ordinary siblings, Nathan was fiercely protective of her. When he was arrested, I remember thinking that there had to be some terrible mistake. The victim was a wealthy businessman named Charles Whitmore. He owned several properties in our town and had a reputation for being powerful, demanding, and extremely successful. One evening, Charles was found dead inside his private office. The police quickly discovered that Nathan had been at the property earlier that night. His fingerprints were found inside the building, security footage showed him entering through a side entrance, and his vehicle was captured by a nearby camera. To make matters worse, investigators found financial records suggesting Nathan had been involved in a dispute with Charles over money. From the moment the police announced Nathan's arrest, the town seemed to make up its mind. People who had known my son for years suddenly spoke about him as though they had always suspected he was capable of violence. Neighbors stopped coming by. Parents whispered when Melissa walked past them at school. Even people who had attended Nathan's childhood birthday parties began repeating the same words they heard on television. They called the evidence overwhelming. They said Nathan had been angry with Charles and that the crime had been a predictable result of their disagreement. I kept insisting that they didn't know my son. But the evidence kept getting worse. Prosecutors claimed Nathan had entered Charles's office intending to confront him about money. They said an argument had escalated and Charles had been killed during the confrontation. Nathan's fingerprints were found on several objects inside the office. His vehicle had been nearby. A partial shoe impression at the scene appeared consistent with the shoes he had been wearing that night. The prosecution also produced a witness who claimed she had seen Nathan leaving the property shortly after the estimated time of death. I sat through the trial, believing that eventually someone would discover the mistake. Nobody did. Nathan was convicted. I will never forget the expression on his face when the verdict was read. He didn't look angry. He didn't look surprised. He looked exhausted. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I could see that he was trying to reassure me, even though his own life had just been taken away. Afterward, he kept telling me that he hadn't killed Charles. He told me that someone had manipulated the evidence, but he couldn't explain how. At the time, I wanted desperately to believe him, but part of me was afraid. What if a mother simply couldn't accept what her child had done? That question haunted me for years. Nathan received a lengthy prison sentence, and our family slowly fell apart. Melissa moved to another state and rarely discussed her brother. My husband, Robert, blamed himself for not noticing how much trouble Nathan was supposedly getting into. Eventually, the constant arguments became too much for us, and our marriage ended. I was left alone in the house where Nathan had grown up, surrounded by photographs of a young man whose life had become a question I couldn't answer. I continued visiting Nathan during the first few years. Every visit ended with the same conversation. He insisted he was innocent. I would tell him that I loved him, but I needed to understand what had happened. He always said there was more to the case than I knew. He told me to look at the security footage and the financial records. He told me to find out why one particular witness had changed her statement. But I didn't know where to begin, and eventually the visits became less frequent. Then, something happened that changed my relationship with him completely. A letter arrived from prison. Nathan wrote that he no longer expected me to believe him. He said he had spent years trying to prove his innocence, but every appeal had failed. He told me he had accepted that he might spend the rest of his life behind bars. He also wrote something that I didn't understand at the time. He said that if I ever wanted to know the truth, I shouldn't start by looking at the murder. I should start by looking at the people who benefited from his conviction. I kept that letter in a drawer for years. I never threw it away, but I never followed his advice either. 15 years passed. I built a quiet life for myself. I worked part-time at a local community center, volunteered at a food pantry, and tried to stop measuring time by Nathan's prison sentence. I still visited him occasionally, but our conversations became shorter. I had convinced myself that perhaps accepting the situation was the only way to survive it. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while I was preparing dinner, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it. When I answered, a prison administrator identified herself and asked whether I was Evelyn Carter. My heart immediately began pounding, because there was only one reason someone from the prison would call me. She told me Nathan had requested an urgent family call. I hadn't spoken to him by phone in months. When his voice finally came through, I barely recognized it. He sounded older, calmer, and strangely certain. For several moments, neither of us said anything. Then he began explaining that something had happened inside the prison that had changed everything. A former inmate had given him information about Charles Whitmore's murder. That information had led Nathan to a name he had never expected to hear. The name belonged to someone I knew, someone I had trusted. Nathan told me that he had spent 15 years believing the truth would eventually come out on its own. It hadn't. So now he needed me to do something he had been afraid to ask me to do all those years ago. He needed me to investigate. I asked him why he suddenly believed I could uncover something that lawyers and investigators had failed to find for 15 years. He explained that the person who had framed him had made one mistake. They had assumed that everyone who loved Nathan had eventually stopped looking for the truth. But Nathan knew me. He knew I would never stop once I truly believed there was something left to uncover. Then he told me the part that changed everything. He said the person who framed him had not disappeared after the trial. That person had remained close to our family. They had attended funerals, visited our home, offered me comfort, and spent years telling me how sorry they were about what happened to my son. They had been sitting in my living room for 15 years, and Nathan knew exactly who it was. I didn't sleep that night. Nathan's words kept circling through my mind, especially the part about the person who had remained close to our family. I went through every person I could remember from the years surrounding his arrest. I thought about relatives, neighbors, lawyers, police officers, family friends, and people who had offered me sympathy after the conviction. There were dozens of faces attached to those memories, but only a few people had remained consistently close to me. I kept asking myself the same question. Who would have had enough access to the case, enough knowledge of Nathan's movements, and enough influence over me to stay close for 15 years without making me suspicious? The next morning, I called Nathan again. He had been expecting me to call, and he sounded relieved when he heard my voice. I told him I needed him to explain everything he knew, but he warned me that some of the information might be difficult to hear. He explained that a former inmate named Marcus had recently been transferred to his prison. Marcus had worked years earlier as a private security contractor for Charles Whitmore. He had never been charged in the murder, but he had known Charles's business operations from the inside. According to Nathan, Marcus had recognized a name in an old newspaper article about the case and immediately realized that Nathan might have been convicted based on information that had been deliberately manipulated. Nathan told me Marcus had described something that had never appeared in the official case file. On the night Charles was killed, there had supposedly been a second vehicle near the property. The police had focused almost entirely on Nathan's car because security footage showed him arriving, but Marcus claimed the other vehicle had been there before Nathan arrived and remained after he left. That meant someone else had been present at the property during the critical period. I asked Nathan why this information had never appeared in court, and he explained that Marcus believed the footage showing the second vehicle had been removed before the police completed their investigation. That immediately made me remember something from the original trial. One of the defense attorneys had repeatedly complained that the prosecution had failed to provide complete surveillance footage. At the time, I assumed it was a technical dispute between lawyers. Now, I wondered whether something much more serious had happened. Nathan told me Marcus had also remembered seeing someone entering Charles's office shortly before Nathan arrived. Marcus couldn't identify the person clearly, but he remembered something unusual about the person's clothing. They had been wearing a distinctive silver watch with a dark leather strap. I knew that watch. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. There was only one person I could remember wearing a watch like that during the years surrounding Nathan's trial. It belonged to Daniel Brooks, Charles Whitmore's longtime business attorney, and one of the people who had become extremely close to me after Nathan's conviction. Daniel had helped me understand the legal process when I felt completely lost. He had brought groceries to my house after difficult court hearings. He had called me on the anniversary of Nathan's sentencing. When my marriage collapsed, Daniel had been one of the people who checked on me regularly. I had trusted him. More than that, I had depended on him. I immediately rejected the possibility. Daniel had been one of the most vocal people who supported me during the trial. He had always spoken about how tragic Nathan's situation was, even though he believed the evidence was convincing. He had told me many times that he hoped Nathan would eventually find peace. The idea that he could somehow have been involved seemed impossible. But when I opened an old photograph album, I found a picture taken at a charity dinner 3 months before Charles's death. Daniel was standing beside Charles, wearing the exact same silver watch Marcus had described. I felt a chill run through me. That photograph didn't prove anything, neither did the watch. But suddenly, memories I had ignored began looking different. Daniel had known Charles extremely well. He had access to Charles's business records. He knew about the financial dispute involving Nathan. He had also been present during several private conversations about the investigation. In fact, I remember Daniel telling me details about the case that I had never seen reported publicly. At the time, I assumed he knew them because of his professional connections. Now, I wondered whether he knew them because he had been closer to the crime than anyone realized. I began searching through the boxes I had stored in my attic. I hadn't opened some of them in years. Old court transcripts, newspaper articles, photographs, letters, and legal documents were still packed inside. I spent hours comparing dates and names. Eventually, I found a copy of the original evidence inventory. One item caught my attention immediately. It was a security recording from the night of the murder. The document stated that the recording had been submitted to investigators, but that several minutes of footage were missing because the file had apparently been corrupted. I remembered Daniel mentioning that exact issue. He had told me years ago that technical problems sometimes happened with surveillance systems. But how would he have known about the missing section before the defense attorney had even raised the issue publicly? I called Nathan and told him what I had found. He became very quiet. He reminded me that during the trial, Daniel had repeatedly advised me not to obsess over missing footage because he believed it wouldn't change the outcome. At the time, I thought he was protecting me from false hope. Now, I began wondering whether he had been protecting himself. Nathan then told me something I had never heard before. The night Charles died, Nathan hadn't gone to the property because of money. He had gone there because Charles had contacted him. Charles had told Nathan that he had discovered something about his own business and wanted to meet privately. Nathan had agreed because Charles had offered to settle the financial dispute between them. Nathan had never told me this because his attorney had advised him not to discuss conversations that couldn't be independently verified. During the trial, the prosecution presented the meeting as evidence that Nathan had been angry and wanted revenge. That changed my understanding completely. Nathan hadn't gone there to threaten Charles. He had gone there because Charles had asked him to come. I began looking into Charles's business records. His company had been involved in property development, construction contracts, and private investments. Several weeks before his death, Charles had apparently discovered irregularities in one of his accounts. Money had been transferred to several shell companies without his authorization. Those transfers eventually led back to a private investment group. Daniel's name appeared on several documents associated with that group. My hands started shaking. I called Nathan again, and this time he told me something even more disturbing. Marcus had remembered that Charles was planning to confront someone about the missing money on the night he died. Nathan had always assumed Charles wanted to confront him about their personal financial dispute, but Marcus said Charles had been furious about something much larger. He had apparently told Marcus that someone close to him had been stealing from his company for years, someone he trusted, someone who knew exactly how to make the records look legitimate. I began to understand why Nathan had been framed. If Charles had discovered financial fraud and intended to expose the person responsible, then the killer needed someone else to take the blame. Nathan had been the perfect target. He had already argued with Charles, he had been at the property that night, his fingerprints were inside the office, he had a financial dispute with the victim. All someone needed to do was manipulate the remaining evidence. But there was still one problem. Why had the police believed the manipulated evidence so completely? That was when I remembered Detective Samuel Reed, the lead investigator who had handled Nathan's case. Detective Reed had retired shortly after the trial. He had rarely spoken publicly about the case afterward. I searched through old newspaper archives and discovered that he had left law enforcement under unusual circumstances. There had been an internal review concerning evidence handling, but the details had never been made public. I contacted him. At first, he refused to speak with me. Then I mentioned Nathan's name. He agreed to meet. We met at a small cafe outside town, and the moment I saw him, I knew he had been carrying something for years. He looked older, tired, and uncomfortable. I placed the photograph of Daniel on the table and asked whether he remembered the silver watch. He stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he finally admitted that he remembered seeing Daniel at the crime scene that night. My heart dropped. Detective Reed explained that Daniel had arrived shortly after the first officers. He claimed he had come because Charles was his client and he was concerned about the situation. But Reed had always found his timing suspicious. Daniel knew details about the scene before officers had released them. He also seemed unusually interested in whether investigators had recovered Charles's financial records. Reed had documented his concerns, but the notes disappeared from the official case file. I asked him who had removed them. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me and explained that 15 years earlier, he had been told by a senior official to stop pursuing certain connections involving Charles's business associates. He had obeyed because he believed the prosecution already had enough evidence against Nathan. Then he admitted the part that destroyed the last bit of doubt I had.
He had later discovered that evidence from the case had been mishandled, but by then, Nathan had already been convicted. I left that cafe with a folder containing copies of Reed's personal notes.
For the first time in 15 years, I had something I had never had before, a reason to believe my son. But when I returned home, I discovered something that made the entire situation even more frightening. Someone had been inside my house. Nothing valuable had been stolen. The television was still there, my jewelry was untouched, my computer hadn't been taken. But the boxes from my attic had been disturbed. Someone had been looking through the old case files. And sitting on my kitchen table was a photograph I had never seen before. It showed Nathan standing outside Charles Whitmore's office on the night of the murder. But Nathan wasn't alone. Standing several feet behind him was a second person. A man wearing a dark jacket. And on his wrist was a silver watch. I stared at the photograph for several seconds before realizing that there was something else in the image. The man's face was turned slightly toward the camera. It was Daniel Brooks. And suddenly, I understood why Nathan had been so certain. The person who had framed my son hadn't merely remained close to our family. He had been waiting 15 years to make sure I never looked closely enough to find him. I spent the rest of that evening sitting at my kitchen table with the photograph in front of me. I couldn't stop looking at Daniel's face in the background. For 15 years, I had allowed myself to believe that the people around me were exactly what they appeared to be. Daniel had been the person who called me when Nathan's appeals were denied. He had brought food to my house when I was too exhausted to cook. He had remembered my birthday when even my own family sometimes forgot. He had told me repeatedly that I needed to accept what happened and stop destroying myself by searching for answers. Now, every one of those memories felt different. I didn't call Daniel. Instead, I called Nathan. When I told him about the photograph, he became silent for several seconds. I could hear the uncertainty in his breathing, and I realized that he was experiencing something I had experienced all evening. We had spent 15 years accepting the version of events presented to us, and now we were looking at evidence that suggested the entire foundation of the case had been manipulated. Nathan told me that during his trial, he had repeatedly tried to explain that Daniel had been unusually interested in the investigation. His lawyers had investigated Daniel briefly, but couldn't establish a direct connection to the murder. The lead investigator's concerns had also disappeared from the official file, leaving them with little they could use in court. I asked Nathan why he hadn't told me more about Daniel during those years. He explained that he had tried several times, but every time he brought Daniel's name up, I dismissed it. He remembered one particular visit when he tried to warn me that Daniel knew details about the case that had never been publicly released. I had interpreted his concerns as desperation from someone trying to find another explanation for his conviction. That memory hurt more than I expected, because I realized my son had been trying to protect me from the truth, while I had been protecting myself from believing him. The following morning, I contacted Detective Reed again. I sent him a copy of the photograph and asked whether he could identify the location. He immediately recognized the building. More importantly, he recognized the vehicle parked behind Nathan. It belonged to a private security company that had been contracted by Charles Whitmore. Reed explained that the company had maintained surveillance around several of Charles's properties because Charles had received threats in the months before his death. The security company had records of its employees and vehicles, but those records had never been included in Nathan's trial. Reed helped me locate the former security supervisor, a man named Leonard Price. Leonard was hesitant to speak at first because he had spent years trying to forget the case.
But when I showed him the photograph, his expression changed. He explained that the dark vehicle belonged to one of the company's supervisors, a man named Victor Hale. Victor had been responsible for maintaining security footage at Charles's properties. He also had access to surveillance recordings before they were delivered to law enforcement. That discovery made everything more complicated.
Victor had died several years earlier, but his employment records remained available. Leonard told us Victor had been close to Daniel and had frequently received private instructions from him. Officially, Daniel was Charles's attorney, but according to Leonard, Daniel sometimes contacted Victor directly and asked him to provide copies of surveillance recordings. Those requests were unusual because attorneys didn't normally have authority to access security footage independently. We began investigating Victor's records. Several months before Charles's death, Victor had received large payments from a private company connected to Daniel. The payments were disguised as consulting fees. There was no clear explanation for the work Victor had supposedly performed. More importantly, the payments increased dramatically in the weeks leading up to Charles's murder. Then we discovered something that changed the entire case. The missing section of surveillance footage had never been corrupted. It had been deleted manually. Victor had accessed the system that night. The deletion occurred approximately 20 minutes after Nathan entered the building. I felt sick when I read that information. The missing footage had been one of the reasons the prosecution couldn't establish exactly what happened inside Charles's office. The defense had argued that another person could have entered the building after Nathan. The prosecution had dismissed that possibility because there was no evidence supporting it. Now, we had evidence. Someone had deliberately removed it. The police reopened their investigation, but because so much time had passed, they had to move carefully. They couldn't arrest Daniel based solely on circumstantial evidence. They needed to establish motive, opportunity, and a connection between him and the manipulated evidence. That meant we had to understand what Charles had discovered before he died. We began examining Charles's financial records more closely. The records showed that millions of dollars had moved through several shell companies over a period of years. The money had eventually been transferred into legitimate-looking investments. The companies appeared unrelated, but when the ownership records were compared, they all led back to the same group of individuals. Daniel was one of them. Another name appeared repeatedly, Victor Hale, and a third name appeared on several older documents, Nathan Carter, my son's name. At first, I thought this proved the prosecution's case. Then Detective Reed explained what had happened. Nathan's name had been used without his knowledge. Years earlier, someone had created a business account using Nathan's personal information. The account had received money and transferred it elsewhere. Nathan had never known about the account because the correspondence had been sent to an old address. Someone had been building a financial trail that would eventually make Nathan look guilty. But why? The answer came from Charles's private records. He had discovered the fraud, and he had started documenting it. Charles had created a private folder containing copies of transactions, company records, and notes about people he suspected. The folder included Daniel's name. It also included Victor's name. Most disturbing of all, Charles had written that he believed someone had been using Nathan's identity to move money. Charles had planned to confront Daniel. That was why Nathan had been called to the property. Daniel knew Charles was about to expose him. He needed someone else to take the blame. Nathan had walked directly into the trap. The evidence began fitting together with horrifying precision. Daniel had access to Charles's business records. Victor controlled the security footage. Nathan already had a documented financial dispute with Charles. Someone had arranged for Nathan to be at the property that night. The surveillance footage was manipulated. Financial records were altered. A witness was pressured into identifying Nathan. Then, Daniel remained close to me afterward, making sure I never questioned the story. But there was still one piece missing: the murder weapon.
the prosecution had never recovered it. Without it, Daniel's defense could still argue that the evidence against him was circumstantial. Then Leonard remembered something. He told Detective Reed that Victor had once mentioned a storage locker outside town. Victor had used it to store old security equipment and company records. After Victor died, his family had emptied most of his belongings. But one locker had remained untouched because nobody knew what was inside. The police obtained a warrant. Inside the locker, they found several boxes. Most contained outdated security equipment. One contained financial records. Another contained photographs. And at the bottom of the final box was a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a handgun.
The weapon had been wrapped carefully and hidden beneath old documents. Ballistic testing eventually confirmed that the weapon had been fired during the night Charles Whitmore was killed. It wasn't registered to Nathan. It wasn't registered to Victor. It had belonged to Daniel. For the first time, the case against Nathan began collapsing. But there was something even more disturbing inside the storage locker. A handwritten note. It had been written by Victor. The note explained that Daniel had instructed him to delete part of the surveillance footage and create the appearance that Nathan was the only person present. Victor admitted that he had been paid to help manipulate the evidence, but he claimed he had never expected Daniel to kill Charles. Victor had believed Daniel only wanted to frighten Charles into remaining silent. Instead, Charles had been killed. Victor had helped cover it up because he was afraid that admitting the truth would destroy his own life. At the bottom of the note was a date. The date was 3 days after Nathan's conviction. And beside it was a sentence that made my blood run cold. Victor had written that Daniel had warned him never to speak because Evelyn Carter was still being watched. I read that sentence repeatedly. For 15 years, I had thought Daniel's kindness was compassion. It wasn't. He had been monitoring me. He had been making sure I remained convinced that my son was guilty. And then I realized something else. The person who had entered my house and searched through my files hadn't been looking for evidence to destroy. They had been looking for the photograph. They knew I had it. Someone had realized I was finally getting close. That meant Daniel knew the truth was beginning to surface. And if he had spent 15 years protecting himself, I couldn't assume he would simply surrender now. The next morning, Detective Reed called me with an update. The police had obtained enough evidence to question Daniel formally. But before they could reach him, Daniel disappeared. His office was empty. His house had been cleared out. His phone was disconnected. And the only thing he left behind was an envelope addressed to me. Inside was a photograph of Nathan as a child. On the back, Daniel had written a message that made me realize the final confrontation was about to begin. He said he had one last piece of evidence, and if I wanted to know why Charles Whitmore really died, I would have to come and get it myself. For the first time in 15 years, I understood what fear really felt like. It wasn't the fear I had experienced when Nathan was arrested, or when the jury returned its verdict. That fear had been mixed with confusion and helplessness. This was different. This was the fear of knowing that someone who had successfully manipulated an entire investigation might realize that his carefully protected secret was finally collapsing. Daniel had disappeared because he knew the evidence was catching up with him. The envelope he had left behind wasn't an apology. It was an invitation. And I knew better than to follow it alone. I immediately gave the envelope to Detective Reed and refused to meet Daniel without the authorities present. The message inside the envelope suggested that Daniel wanted me to believe he was still in control, but the evidence we had already uncovered told a different story.
His surveillance footage, financial records, Victor's confession, and the murder weapon were all pointing in the same direction. Still, Detective Reed warned me that we couldn't assume Daniel would simply run forever. People who spend years protecting a secret sometimes become more dangerous when they realize they are about to lose control of it. The police traced Daniel's movements through financial transactions and eventually discovered that he had rented a small property several hours outside town under a different name. Investigators surrounded the location early the following morning. Daniel was arrested without incident, but he refused to answer questions until his attorney arrived. I watched from a distance as officers escorted him toward the waiting vehicle, and I felt something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt exhaustion. 15 years of wondering whether my son had committed a terrible crime had finally led to this moment, and somehow it didn't feel like victory. The investigation continued for several weeks. Detectives reconstructed the night Charles Whitmore died using evidence that had been hidden or altered during the original case. They discovered that Daniel had been stealing money from Charles's company through shell corporations for years. Charles eventually discovered the scheme and began collecting evidence. When Daniel realized Charles was preparing to expose him, he arranged for Nathan to meet Charles that evening. Daniel knew Nathan was already involved in a financial dispute with Charles, which made him the perfect person to blame. Nathan had entered the building believing he was meeting Charles to discuss the dispute. While Nathan was inside, Daniel arrived through another entrance. Victor Hale had already been instructed to manipulate the security system. Daniel confronted Charles about the financial records, and the confrontation escalated. Charles threatened to expose everything. Daniel shot him, then used Nathan's presence to create the appearance that Nathan had committed the crime. Victor deleted the critical surveillance footage and later helped Daniel construct a false timeline. The prosecution's case had been built around evidence that looked convincing because almost every important piece had been carefully manipulated. Nathan's fingerprints were genuine because he had actually been inside the office. His vehicle really had been outside. His financial dispute with Charles was real. The witness really had seen him leaving. What nobody knew was that Daniel had deliberately arranged circumstances that made every truthful detail point toward a false conclusion. That was what made the deception so effective. That became an important lesson for me. Daniel had not controlled people through one method. He used fear with some, money with others, and trust with people like me. He understood exactly what each person needed to hear. With me, he played the role of the loyal friend who believed in me when everyone else seemed to have disappeared. He encouraged me to accept Nathan's conviction because he knew that if I continued searching, I might eventually uncover the truth. The revelation that hurt me most was discovering how often Daniel had been inside my home during those 15 years. He had attended family gatherings. He had sat beside me during holidays. He had listened to me cry about Nathan. He had told me that some things couldn't be changed and that I needed to move forward. I had believed those words came from someone who cared about me. Now, I understood that he had been protecting himself every time he told me to stop looking backward.
Nathan's conviction was eventually overturned after prosecutors reviewed the newly discovered evidence. The court acknowledged that critical evidence had been withheld and manipulated, and that the original investigation had failed to meet the standards required for a fair trial. When Nathan walked out of the courthouse as a free man, I stood waiting for him with tears running down my face. He looked older than the son I remembered from 15 years earlier, but when he hugged me, I could still feel the same child who used to fall asleep on my shoulder when he was little. I apologized to him. For 15 years, I had carried the guilt of not believing him completely. Nathan didn't blame me. He told me that he understood why I had struggled. He knew how convincing the evidence had been, and he knew how much pressure I had been under. But I still wished I had listened harder.
I wished I had trusted the son I knew instead of the evidence created by someone I thought I knew.
Daniel eventually faced trial for Charles's murder, financial fraud, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. The prosecution presented the documents recovered from Victor's storage locker, the financial records, the ballistic evidence, the surveillance records, and testimony from people who had finally decided to tell the truth. Daniel continued insisting that Nathan had been responsible, but the evidence was overwhelming. The same system that had once convicted my son now had to acknowledge how badly it had failed him. Daniel was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Victor's involvement was also formally acknowledged, although he had died before the truth came out. The former witness received protection after cooperating with investigators. Several people connected to Charles's business faced financial investigations of their own. The case became an example of how a convincing story can sometimes be more dangerous than an obvious lie when the wrong person has enough influence to construct it. But for me, justice wasn't simply about seeing Daniel convicted. It was about getting my son back.
Nathan had missed birthdays, family celebrations, opportunities, relationships, and years that nobody could return. He had entered prison as a 24-year-old man and walked out at 39. There was no sentence that could make those years disappear. No apology from the justice system could restore his youth. No amount of money could replace the ordinary moments that had been stolen from him. So we decided not to spend the rest of our lives defined by what Daniel had done. Nathan eventually found work repairing electrical systems again. He had always been good with his hands, and he slowly rebuilt the life that had been taken from him. He reconnected with Melissa, who had spent years carrying her own guilt because she had been young when everything happened. Their relationship wasn't repaired instantly, but they worked at it. They learned to talk about the past without allowing it to control every conversation about the future.
As for me, I finally understood something about trust that I had never understood before. Trust isn't simply believing someone because they have been kind to you. Trust also requires paying attention. Daniel had been kind to me. He had been generous. He had been supportive. But he had also repeatedly encouraged me not to ask questions. I had mistaken that for compassion. The truth taught me that genuine love doesn't fear questions. Genuine friendship doesn't require you to ignore evidence. And genuine loyalty doesn't ask you to abandon someone simply because the majority has decided they are guilty. 15 years after Nathan was taken away, I finally watched him walk through our front door again. I had kept his childhood room almost exactly as it had been, even though I had told myself many times that I was only keeping it because I couldn't bear to change it. He stood in the doorway and laughed when he saw the old posters still hanging on the wall. For the first time in years, the house sounded like my son again. The past will always be part of our story. I can't erase those 15 years. Nathan can't get them back. But we finally stopped living inside Daniel's version of events. We had our own truth now. And sometimes, after years of betrayal, that is where healing begins. Not by pretending the pain never happened, not by forgetting the person who caused it, but by refusing to let what they did determine the rest of your life.
There are some stories that make you question everything you thought you understood about trust, and Nathan's story is one of them. For 15 years, I believed the evidence because I couldn't understand how an entire system could be wrong. I watched my son lose his freedom while the person responsible remained close to me, offering comfort and pretending to share my pain. Looking back, the most painful part wasn't discovering that Daniel had betrayed us. It was realizing how easily I had mistaken his manipulation for kindness. Nathan always told me he was innocent, but I was so overwhelmed
Nathan can never get those 15 years back, and that is something our family will always carry. But he finally has the chance to build a life that belongs to him. Daniel was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for his role in Charles Whitmore's murder, the financial fraud, and the conspiracy that destroyed Nathan's life. The evidence eventually exposed everything he had tried to hide, including the manipulation of the surveillance footage and the financial records. Justice came late, but it came. And while it could never erase what happened, it gave Nathan something he had been denied for 15 years: the freedom to finally have his own name back. What this experience taught me is that betrayal doesn't always arrive looking like an enemy. Sometimes betrayal comes disguised as friendship, compassion, and loyalty. Sometimes the person telling you to stop searching is the very person who is terrified of what you might find. I also learned that believing someone you love doesn't mean ignoring facts, but facts should always be questioned when something doesn't make sense. And if someone is truly innocent, they deserve the opportunity to be heard, rather than being permanently defined by the version of events created by someone else. Now, I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, and your own child had been convicted because the evidence against them looked overwhelming, would you have continued believing them after 5, 10, or even 15 years? Or would you eventually have accepted the conviction as the truth? And if you later discovered that the person who framed them had been someone you trusted for years, would you ever be able to forgive yourself for not believing your child sooner? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I genuinely want to know what you would have done. Thank you for staying with me through Nathan's story. If this story touched you, please like this video, subscribe to Echoes of Trust and Betrayal. Share this story with someone who enjoys emotional stories about family, secrets, betrayal, and justice. And leave your thoughts in the comments. And before you go, tell me where in the world you're listening from. Every story we share here reminds us that trust can take years to build, seconds to destroy, and sometimes a lifetime to understand. This is Echoes of Trust and Betrayal, and I'll see you in the next story.